On today's episode of the Glad Triad podcast, I'm joined by Dr. Sean Innerst. He is a professor of theology and catechetics at the Augustine Institute and also a former Quaker, like the guy in his oatmeal squares. We're going to find out about his conversion story, as well as the story of Catholic education and the importance of Catholicism and schooling. Hey, a great shout out to our patrons and channel members who help make our show possible. Going over to patreon.com/gladtriadpodcast if you'd like to support the show, or click that button below and become a channel member. And hey, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and share this video far and wide. Now, without further ado, this is the Glad Triad Podcast. How's it going, everybody? This is Jordan Pacheco from the Glad Triad Podcast. I hope you're doing well. I've been so excited for our next guest here. I'm joined today by Dr. Sean Innerst. He is professor of theology, or one of our professors of theology and catechetics at the Augustine Institute, that secrety place, not so secret, where I work down in the editing studio. So we're going to have an absolute great conversation today. Sean, hey, thank you so much for coming on. How are you doing today?
I'm very well. It's a great pleasure.
It's always funny because I don't usually see you in civilians. I always see you in your professor kind of garb. So I like your style here.
Yeah. This is me in mufti, right? That's for the occasion.
Awesome. Oh, that's absolutely great. Praise God. Well, we're gonna get off to the races. There are a few different topics that I especially wanted to discuss with you. But first and foremost, for our audience, I wanted to kind of know more about you. One of the great pleasures of working with you for the last few years is getting to know you. And you, like a lot of our professors actually at the AI, are a convert, and you came from the Quaker tradition, which is, you're probably the first Quaker, ex-Quaker I've ever met besides my oatmeal squares. So so I was hoping that you would regale us with a little bit of a story of growing up as a Quaker. What did that actually entail, and what was the thing that drove your conversion to the Catholic faith?
Well, yeah, it is a different story. I mean, most of my colleagues and the people I've known in the past, famous public converts, are usually theological converts. People who've thought very deeply about pressing issues of faith and come to Catholic convictions that way. As you mentioned, right, I was raised as a Quaker. The American Society of Friends is the official title of the group, and so Quakers are not particularly theological, right? It's not like evangelicalism, where you've got firm theological positions all neatly worked out in very neat boxes. Quakerism is largely anti-creedal, anti-liturgical. So it's a very spare form of Protestantism. It's probably in the very far left part of the spectrum, the Protestant spectrum, and so and it very George Fox, the founder of Quakerism, very much stressed the importance of what he called the inner light. So it's very much a subjectivist form of Christianity, which very much stresses the importance of individual experience, right? So to grow up as a Quaker is largely to be left to your own devices in many ways.
Okay.
It's beautiful in some ways, the simplicity. I have very wonderful memories of going to Quaker meeting. We used to occasionally, not all the time, when I was young, we would occasionally go to a place called the Warrington Meeting in Pennsylvania. I grew up in South Central Pennsylvania, largely.
Okay.
And Warrington Meeting was a very charming, very old Quaker meeting house. It was very, very rustic. The benches had been there since the 1700s, and
Wow.
And it had these large fireplaces on all four walls, but it was just a big open meeting area. Maybe a flagstone floor. I don't recall if it was wood or flagstone. These are remote memories from my youth. But I remember sitting on these wooden benches, and smelling the smoke from those those fireplaces on a Sunday
Mm.
morning, and everybody just sitting there quietly in the crackling fire,
Oh,
and,
wow.
the creaking of the benches, things like that, and just silent, because silent meeting is the mode of worship, and, it's called meeting for worship, and so there's a period of silence observed for, at variable periods,
Hmm.
and as children, for sometimes we were there for a short time, and then they would take us away for, sort of Sunday school kinds of things, but we always spent some time with our parents just in silence, waiting for the Spirit to move each one of us, in whatever way He will. And then occasionally adults would stand up and speak, and that kind of thing.
So in
Uh,
this kind of silent meeting sort of thing, so you guys are sitting there, and is it meditations on the Bible, and then when an adult speaks, it's not there's there's not a hierarchy to the congregation. So if you kind of want to share, if you will, or something, then someone would stand up and do that.
yeah, so there's, along with a complete lack of clear creedal expressions and liturgical expressions, there's no clergy. Everyone is just a believer. Everyone's a friend,
Mm.
and so people stand up and speak as they are moved. There would be officers of the meeting. There would be a clerk of the meeting to take care of business matters and things like that. But there isn't a clergy, so everyone may stand up and speak later on in the meeting as they feel moved by the Spirit. So, and you know, it depended on where you were,
Mhm.
whether or not be religious or political, what they had to say, because the Quakers were very much interested in political action,
Okay.
uh, kind of famous for being pacifists, and so at that time, when I was young, the Vietnam War was in its early stages, and
Mm.
so people were very concerned about war, and we were very anti-war. So
Mhm.
there a lot of the people felt moved to speak on matters of that kind. Occasionally, we would talk about Jesus also.
Got it. So one thing that's interesting is again, to be a Quaker is very curious because I'm so used to so many other different kind of denominations. This is a very, as far as America is concerned, this is a very quintessential old denomination as far as America's establishment. Do Quakers, besides just having their meetings and the sort of conduct that they do, is it oriented to live in community? Like, would you kind of live close together as Quakers, or are y'all spread out like everyone else is?
No, I mean, it might have been so in the early days, but Quakerism, isn't like um, the Amish, for example, or the Mennonites, um, in a number of respects. But they tried to live plainly, simply, but they would engage in ordinary um, mercantile and agricultural pursuits like everybody else. But we didn't live in communities. I mean, it would have been characteristic everywhere in
Yeah.
early America for people to live in communities of people of like mind and that sort of thing. But it was nothing formal about communal living.
How did you regard other denominations and Catholics?
Um, well, um, yeah, that's kind of interesting. We because we weren't creedal, um, there tends to be a fair amount of religious relativism
Hmm.
and syncretism. So people would read you know materials from other religious traditions, things like that. And um, so there's not an exclusivity in Quakerism, just by virtue of its character.
Hmm.
Uh, and But I mean, we would have thought, because we were very liberal, right? We would have thought of, you know, fundamentalist evangelicals as being, kind of, um, you know, uh, off-putting.
Yeah.
Uh, my dad, my dad's father was a United Brethren minister,
Hmm.
so they actually came from the United Brethren, which are also one of the peace churches. and and he had parted ways with the United Brethren actually during World War II, when the
Mm,
United Brethren decided not to oppose World War II. So he was a strict pacifist and decided to become Quaker instead. And so that was sort of
gotcha.
the reason for our affiliation. Um, but I remember my father talking about my grandfather's opposition to like camp meetings and
Mm-hmm.
revivals and things like that. He thought they were, terribly gauche, and he was kind of he was an intellectual, and he very much in the in the mold of figures like uh, you know Emerson, right, Thoreau.
Yeah.
From
Whitman. Uh-huh.
Yeah, yeah, they were sort of religious nonconformists, and they were serious about their religion, but it led them to particular positions that made all kinds of formal religious expressions uncomfortable for them. So
Mm,
Catholicism was unthinkable. I mean, it was
yeah.
just, yeah, it was absolutely unacceptable. Um, although, you know, they liked St. Francis because they thought of St. Francis as
Uh-huh. Yeah, as
proto.
a pacifist hippie, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So all those dreamy visions of St. Francis and whatever mold you care to cast him in, that was the way they thought of St. Francis. So I remember my grandfather and grandmother having coffee table books on St. Francis, and the sea
Mm.
lying around, that sort of thing, and even maybe even a little wooden statue or something. I don't know.
This is so fascinating for people who it's just very strange to me. Like you might, in my mind, you might make a case. Okay, the Anglicans may have a saint, although I don't ever understand why. Sometimes I read a Wikipedia article and they're like Saint Thomas More, venerated in the Anglican Communion. I'm like, literally how? Or the Lutherans might have something like that. But it is very interesting, and I've seen this before with different Protestant groups where even with the fact that Saint Francis, of course, is like absurdly Catholic, but there are different saints that other denominations will kind of pick up on and venerate in their own way. In a way,
Mm,
certainly not have. No, there's no problem having a Saint Francis statue or a book on the saints with different friends that I have. It's very interesting.
yeah, yeah. So the Quakers, as I say, they're non liturgical, and one of their dicta was that no day is different than any other. Um, so they referred to Sunday as first day. So
Mm.
we didn't go to Sunday school; we went to first day school, uh, and so they were neuralgic about marking days in particular ways. So in traditional Quakerism, no Easter, no Christmas, uh,
Oh. Hmm.
no festivals of that kind. Every day is holy, so or not so much, depending on how you see that, eradication of all holy days.
You said something earlier that you said you guys weren't cradle Quaker, and that's because does that mean that your grandfather, when he left the other denomination,
United
was
Brethren. Mhm.
United Brethren? So were you guys already alive, or were you already alive? I guess it was your father. I know that's such a funny question. Not quite like that, but like when did he leave? I guess that's the question.
Yeah, that was World War II, and I was born
Okay.
in 1956. So
Yeah.
they my grandfather had to get a job basically. So he left the ministry with the United Brethren and joined what was called the Friends Church,
Mm.
which is sort of a more a more articulated form of Quakerism. So they had ministers and they had churches, and he had to have an income. So he joined that, which is sort of high Quaker, um, and
Uh-huh.
but then eventually was able to join the low Quakers, and left the Friends Church, and got a job actually working for the American Friends Service Committee in Washington D.C. of all things. So
Wow. Okay. When you were growing up as a Quaker, were you pretty attached to your faith? Did you figure, yeah, okay, I'll probably end up dying as this?
no, that thought wouldn't have occurred to me. I seldom thought of death when I was a child. Um, no, uh, it was just what we did, you know.
Uh-huh.
And my parents were, they were devout persons, right? They were pious in the sense that they had both been raised in very religious homes.
Mm,
They had both, sung in their United Brethren church choirs and things like that when they were young, and my dad's dad was a minister, in fact, and um, so everything that goes with being a minister's kid, um, and they were regular Bible readers, and I would see them pray, so they were good Christian people in accord with their lights, and I found that moving. I was always, I was moved by religious things. I was, the Bible stirred my
mm.
soul.
Yeah. Well, as it should. Good on. So what was the
Yes.
impetus then? What was the first kernel of moving towards the Catholic faith?
Well, actually, the thing that woke me up to the possibility of Catholicism was actually my father's conversion. So my father converted first, and under kind of odd circumstances. It was, uh, because we were Quakers and we were pacifists. Uh, he couldn't join the church,
Mm.
in its full form. So, but he was sort of awakened to the Catholic worker movement, which is also
Oh, mhm.
pacifist.
Yeah.
So he was very interested in Dorothy Day and Peter Morin, her
Mhm.
sidekick, and so it was actually through that avenue that he started getting interested, and my dad was a writer, and a journalist, and was just interested in things he was reading about, and he got interested in European culture, the Italians, the Spanish, what's going on,
Gotcha.
this church thing. He was very romantic. He was a very romantic man, um, and so anyway, he ended up contacting the Barragans. I don't know if you remember the Barragan brothers.
Arrogance. I don't think so.
They were radical. Dan and Phil Barragan were their names. Dan was a Jesuit who ended up being in the movie The Mission.
Oh, okay.
So
I love that
anyway,
movie.
it was a strange feature of that movie is that it had a
Yeah.
real Jesuit in it. But anyway, uh, Phil and Dan Berrigan were anti-war activists, both of them priests. Phil was a diocesan priest in the Diocese of Baltimore, I think,
Mhm.
and Dan Berrigan was a Jesuit. So they were, they had been arrested in anti-war demonstrations and things like that. So my dad went to talk to, I think, Phil Berrigan, and in Maryland, because we
Mm.
weren't far from there, and had a discussion, and Father Phil Berrigan recommended that my father go and speak to this other priest, whose name I don't recall now. It may come to me, but so anyway, that this priest received my father into the church. So he was baptized. Um, I think he was baptized. We weren't baptized as children as Quakers because there was no
There's no
sacrament.
such thing. Mhm.
Yeah. So so anyway, he was received into the church, but he was very quiet about it. Never spoke of it. He just started collecting books, and a little crucifix went up on the wall about this big, and that's what signaled his conversion. But I didn't know what any of that meant,
Mm.
and you get inklings from conversations with the parents that my grandfather was definitely not pleased. He thought
Mm.
he was
Gotcha.
insane, and his relationship with my father was strained anyway because my father had not chosen to go to jail during World War II rather
Gotcha.
than serve. So my father ended up becoming a medic
Mhm.
in World War II, but that wasn't enough to satisfy my grandfather. So they had a strained relationship.
Mm.
Um, So anyway, it was my father really who induced this sort of subtle suggestion of Catholicism, and I started picking up the books that he was gathering on his shelf and reading those, and so I started to be influenced actually just secretly through my reading. It's like I'm sort of discovering these little things, and I'm reading the Bible. I started listening to Bach,
Yeah.
and Mozart. I was
Very
I was a
hip. Very
melancholic
hip.
teenager.
By the way, I just want to say for the record, I find it very funny. I think as Catholics, we've done this with Bach and with C.S. Lewis. Bach was a Lutheran, but of course did a lot of his composition for the Polish king.
Yep.
And C.S. Lewis is an Anglican, but I think we've kind of quietly just been like, yeah, but if we sneak this in there, we'll forgive this.
Yeah. So as I said, we were very romantic people, and
Yeah.
so I was moved by the music, St. Matthew Passion, all these things. He's writing music for masses. What's going on here? What is that? So I'm just sort of feeling my way along, and my imagination is running wild. And I found books on St. Francis, and I read those biographies. I stumbled on a book that my father had on Padre Pio.
Whoa.
And this
Early
just
Padre Pio. Okay.
oh my goodness, this is like, what the heck is going on here?
Stigmatas.
What's going on? I always tell people that I was basically converted by the Franciscans, right? Because and once again, not anything particularly theologically complicated at all. It's just I fell in love with Jesus through reading my little New Testament, my little blue New Testament about this big. I still have it. And listening to Bach, and and reading these stories, and just thinking Jesus is the most wonderful thing in the world. And then I discover St. Francis, in the 1200s, and this guy also has a stigmata. What's going on with that? And then I find Padre Pio, who died in 1968, and it was only a few years after his death that I discovered this book about him. And it's like, oh my goodness, there's a third person here with a stigmata. And I basically drew a straight line between these 3 points, three crucified men.
Wow.
Christ, Francis, and Padre Pio, and it just forms a straight line, and it's like it looks like it goes straight into the Catholic Church. So, it wasn't that complicated. I was just overthrown by the otherness of it. Right? Because everything in my experience was so black.
Yeah.
It was nice, and it was quiet and everything, but the radicality of this, this energetic embrace of the Christian ideal that you see in figures like Francis or Padre Pio, where God so clearly seems to be breaking in and changing hearts and lives and performing miracles, is just, it was really the otherness of it that drew me in. I was talking to some of my students. I also discovered, The Imitation of Christ by Thomas à Kempis, and I'm reading that, and I'm reading along with my students in my seminar right now, and a lot of them are shocked by its radicality. He says that, until you were mud, until you were, the mud under the feet of, those who scorn you, you're not you're not sufficiently conformed to Christ, and they're a little shocked by this. This is not spiritual books of the modern type.
Yeah, no, not quite. No, I always say Thomas à Kempis is my go-to spiritual reading, because I tend to be so sanguine that my natural inclination is the books that say that God really loves you even when you suck. But Thomas à Kempis for me is like, he writes, he's like Luther without the edgelord Protestant status. Sometimes like we get there and we're like, we pull back, which I like.
Yeah, Luther apparently liked him very much. So.
Oh, well, there you go. I could understand.
There are problems with the Devotio Moderna, you could say.
So when were you officially received into the church then?
It was 1974. Okay. I was reading as a high school student, and and was sort of fascinated by it. And in the summertime, I was basically a Catholic. When I was in high school, at one point my parents were wondering what the heck is going on with this kid,
Mhm.
because I decided I was going to be St. Francis, and so I set up a tent in my backyard and I slept on the ground,
Oh, I would
and
kill to
I
see
ate
that,
nothing
okay.
but oatmeal.
Uh, as is your Quaker roots demand, of course.
That's right. And I hand carved crucifix that I hung up in the corner of my tent, and
Wow.
it's sort of like Saint Teresa of Avila deciding with her brother to go and live as hermits in the backyard and that kind
Mhm.
of thing. So anyway, I was fascinated by all of this stuff.
Did you ever consider joining the Franciscans?
I did. Yeah, as a
Mhm.
matter of fact, once I entered the church, I was received into the church by the Dominicans, actually,
Okay.
at the
Oh, good.
center at the college where I was going, and at the University of New Mexico. And you're
Oh,
from
okay.
there.
Okay. You're at University of New Mexico, UNM. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's where my parents met there.
Yeah.
That's like deep in the family history.
So the Dominican staff the Newman Center on
Mhm.
the campus there, and it's very beautiful. It was in those days. It was very, very simple, very
Yeah.
beautiful, sort of territorial, southwestern territorial style, and
Mhm.
had a huge crucifix at the front. That was there were there was like there was a rosary. Um, what's it called? A frieze on the walls. Sort of bas relief kind of
Oh,
thing,
mhm.
running up the walls on the outside, and a huge crucifix up at the front, much larger than life size. And it wasn't that
Wow.
large a chapel, so it was very imposing.
Mhm.
And I remember the first mass I went to. I asked my dad if he would take me to mass, and so he took me,
Wow.
and it was an odd experience because I went in, and here's this huge crucifix. It's the first time I've been in this church and chapel, really, and there's a huge crucifix looming over the altar, and the priest who comes out to celebrate, I think his name was Father Dunphy. But anyway, he was not a Dominican, but he was living in the house on campus
Mm.
and studying, I think, or something. I'm not sure what he was doing there. But anyway, this guy had long black hair and a beard.
Oh,
So this was the 70s, right?
this was
So
the 70s, yeah.
hippie priest. But here I am, in my teens, and I walk in. It was always early mass, so it was 6 a.m.
Yeah.
And we went in there, and I thought, oh my goodness, Jesus is here to celebrate this thing.
There's your in persona Christe right there.
Oh my goodness. And it was very quiet, very meditative,
Yeah.
early morning, only a few people there. Brother Allan, the Dominican, old style Dominican, was sitting up there in the choir,
Mhm.
with his Dominican habit sort of bowed over, and I was just enthralled by it, and it was Novus Ordo, because that's what we had then,
Mhm.
it's just at the very beginning of the whole, you know. But I had no experience of the old church. My dad
Yeah.
had,
Mm.
but I had no experience of what had come prior, and this just looked terribly mysterious and wonderfully evocative, and it just filled my imagination, and I thought, oh, this has got to be it, right? So I started
Wow.
going to my dad every Sunday thereafter, and didn't get the best introduction to the church through what was going on at a campus Newman Center in the 70s. There was
Well,
a lot
at
of
least it was staffed by the Dominicans, which means you probably had a better chance than some. Because I had an uncle that went to the seminary in New Mexico. This would probably been in the
oh
'70s as well, and he actually left, and he was like they had a lot of corruption and a lot of just the everything was going out the window, and so actually later the rector of the seminary wrote him saying, "Come back, we've cleaned up, we changed our ways." But he had met my aunt at that point, so
yeah,
that was that.
I remember visiting that seminary and I was pretty shocked.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So probably good to be under under the wings of Dominicans. So you
Yeah.
didn't. So you considered didn't end up joining the Franciscans, but you did determine. But when did you determine? Okay, it's not just one thing to become a Catholic and live a Catholic life, but to actually make your entire career. Because I don't know what your trajectory was at that point as a young man, but to actually make your career into Catholic education.
Well, uh, I I went to school. I was in college, and I wasn't doing a very good job of it. Um, I was a little too dreamy and that kind of thing. And it was the 70s, and in fact, I was in the church for a few years, and then because of the influences that I was under and my own weakness, right,
Uh
like
huh.
I said, um, because I mean, I had not been introduced. Nobody ever asked me to go to confession, and I was
Mm.
baptized at 18,
Yeah.
so I didn't have to go to confession. But I was never introduced to the sacrament. There were
Got it.
there were no confession times advertised.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't really have a typical vital Catholic life. I was just sort of romantically involved, you
Right.
know.
Right.
Um, so it was kind of easy to pull me out. I had this vision of the 13th century, which
Mm.
had sort of filled my head from the reading I was doing. I was just wandering through the stacks at the university, pulling out odd Catholic books and trying to
Mm-hmm.
piece something together. And and but because of the influence of my comrades, my fellow students, some of my friends were artists and very liberal
Mm-hmm.
and not living the best sorts of lives. I basically fell out after being
As soon as coming
converted.
in. Wow.
Yeah, and did things that we don't have to go through, right? Lots of waywardness and drug use and all kinds of things.
Right. Well, and to
Got
be fair, like I'm glad that you brought up what even this thing in this, my joke has been for some people is I think that the church memory hold the 70s and
Yeah,
started picking itself up. But I've had some guests on this show who they were in California after the changes, after the Sisters of the Sacred Heart kind of ripped up their habits and stuff. And he actually remembers one of the quintessential Irish priests, right, out there in California, actually ripping up a rosary on the pulpit saying that we don't need the trappings of sacramentals. So not saying that that was obviously like mandated, that wasn't like prescribed post the council or anything, but just unfortunately it seems like, yeah, a lot of, even down to my uncle's story, like a lot of the medicine that Catholics think about when you think about sacrament of confession, for instance, or the
mhm,
importance of the Eucharist or something, a lot of it, yeah, it was just very garbled for
yep,
a lot of that decade. So it's unfortunate, but I think that that's a very common case that there wasn't as much medicine, if you will.
oh yeah. I didn't. I had this vision of what sanctity looked like because I had read the lives of the saints, and it was largely hagiography that converted me.
Mm, mhm,
And and I sort of got the sense that the church I had joined didn't exist anymore.
mhm.
That's sort of the way I felt about it. And I didn't have I had no good advice. I had no good advisors. The pastor there had been a good friend to me, and he's the one who baptized me. But
Yeah,
he was, you know, he was there getting a doctorate
yeah.
in literature. He just so I did not have guidance of any real kind, and I sort of went to various places in the area trying to find priests and that kind of thing.
Mhm.
But I just felt the lure of the world, and I basically just fell out.
Went to
And
it.
it took me a
Mhm.
while to get back, actually.
Gotcha.
But once I came back, I was working in television. I was an engineer. You know,
That's why we're kindred spirits.
yeah, that's right. So I worked at KNME, the the public television station there, and I'm
Mhm.
voiceover announcer and on air engineer. And so, uh, and bit by bit, I started to feel a longing to return to the church, and I had dreams actually of going back to one of the parishes where I had attended, and
Mhm.
people finding me there and being very embarrassed. What are you doing here? So I had these kinds of dreams like this,
Mm.
right? And I would turn. I remember turning and leaving, running out of the church, and going back to my little apartment near the university in my dream and finding a woman there, right? who was very kind and beautiful, and kind of like my mother, but I didn't really know who she
Huh.
was.
Okay.
And I had this dream recurrently. So I was a sinner, and I couldn't be in the church, but I would go home and I would find this woman. And I didn't have a Marian devotion because that had never been encouraged.
Yeah.
And I hadn't really begun saying the rosary or anything because that was out of style, as you were saying.
Hmm.
Um, and so anyway, I only later understood what those dreams represented. And and one night, I was walking up and down the street, very restless, very unhappy, with my whole life. And I walked past that church that in my dreams I was repeatedly getting kicked out
Wow.
of.
Hmm.
And it was the middle of the night. And I went and just on a whim, I pulled the door and it opened. And that church was always locked, right?
Mm.
I, the door opened and I walked in. It was completely dark, nothing but the tabernacle lamp. And I just had the deepest sense that he's not going to kick me out, right, for what I've
Wow.
done. And so I went in there and I prayed, and that was basically, the beginning of my return. So that's when I started exploring what's confession, how do we do this, how do I go back
Uh,
in,
wow.
and and later I realized that it was, the Blessed Mother who had been coming
Yeah.
to me in my dreams and encouraging me to stay, and
Wow.
this kind of thing. And I discovered her by in strange circumstances later on also. So
Wow, that is overwhelmingly beautiful. I have a good friend who appears on the show from time to time. He was a like Baptist. He was like a very like Church of Wells kind of fundamentalist,
mm,
but he was having such a crisis of faith because he was worried that I'm not saved. That was his thing, and he would kind of cry out and have these really big bouts. And it was actually through the voice of Our Lady that told him to come home essentially. And
yeah,
he was baptized, but cradle Catholic family that fell away like instantly. And but just that here to come home. So I think I am more and more aware of sometimes how appreciative I am of sometimes some of us, we can read ourselves into the faith, we can kind of sit there and just find ourselves in the faith, and sometimes it's nice that mom comes down and is like, yeah, no, it's time to come home.
yeah, that's right.
As you were coming back into the faith, you're working in TV,
Yep.
noble profession. But why? I mean, but I mean, and one could say nowadays that it's not like you're doing anything terribly different than being an on-air sort of announcer, considering the sort of work that we do.
Yep.
But what made the switch? Because it's one thing to come back to the faith and to be a strong Catholic, but another thing entirely again to devote your life to its promulgation.
Yeah. Well, the thing that changed me was that I started making vocational inquiries, right? So
Mm,
I uh, I thought, after I returned to the church, I had been working at the television station for about 7 years, and and I thought, you know what, drive it or park it. Let's find out if God's calling you to priesthood or religious life. So I
mm-hmm.
started making inquiries, and um, and that's what drew me into education because I had to go to seminary. So
Gotcha.
I joined the Oblates of the Virgin Mary, the OMVs,
Mm-hmm.
and I went to Boston, and I spent 3 years there, 2 years as a postulant and 1 year as a
Wow.
novice. And I got a second degree in philosophy, so the little PhD 2 year um, you know course in philosophy to make up for what was lacking from my BA degree. So
Mm-hmm.
and that's what made me recognize that this is what I was supposed to do. So it was a complicated discernment process, but they basically did not um, recommend me for vows.
Mm.
So because they saw something in me, a kind of restiveness. And so anyway, the day they said they weren't going to recommend me for vows, I went outside and laid on the grass outside the novitiate house, and I looked up into a perfectly clear blue sky,
Mm-hmm.
and Our Lady said to me, I have something else for you."
Mm.
So from that moment, I was completely free. I thought, okay,
Yep.
let's just find out what
You
that
tell
is.
me.
So, yeah, right. So, but the Oblates had given me great education. I got to study with Peter Kraft and Thomas
Nice.
Howard,
Mm-hmm.
David Lang, who was a great Thomist, uh, some Ted Ribard, who ended up at St. Thomas in Houston.
Mm.
Uh, so I got a great, brief, microwave Thomistic philosophical education, which was in some ways unmatched because I couldn't have gotten that if I'd gone to other colleges because
Yeah.
this part of the educational formational program of Catholicism had basically been destroyed. So I
Mm-hmm.
was very lucky in that regard. It was Providence. And so once I left, I realized, I just want to keep doing this. I just want to move forward. And so a friend of mine in Albuquerque, who just lived a few blocks away from me, who had also been in the seminary there in Boston, and I didn't know him in Albuquerque, but I got to know him in Boston, and then we returned home. And I said, "Do you want to go and get a master's degree?" So
Like you do.
yeah, like you do. And so anyway, that's what we did. So we applied to Steubenville Franciscan
Hmm.
University, and we drove east together. And somebody gave us a car.
Is this the 80s at this point?
No, this is early '90s now. So I was
Okay.
with the
Oh, still
Oblates from
hospitality. Nice.
'86 to '89, and then I
Wow.
was out
Okay.
for just a bit, and then I went in '90 and got there mid-year in 1990 in January
That's great.
1991 actually. And so we studied there for 2 years, lived together. He's now Father James Sanchez in the Archdiocese of Santa Fe, and a wonderful, wonderful guy, terrific priest. Um, so anyway, we were very close friends, and when we were in Steubenville, I met my wife, Kathy,
Hey. Hmm.
and was hired out of the MA program by then Bishop Chaput in Rapid City, South Dakota,
Wow.
with Tim Gray, who was one of my classmates at Franciscan. And so we both went and taught, Tim in the schools, and I was the diocesan DRE for parish religious education. And that's what got me started. He hired me um, and put me to work, and I just loved what I was doing. I just loved
Yep.
teaching catechesis, but I aspired to go on and get a doctorate. And he said if I worked for him for 7 years, he would help me do that. Um, so that's what happened. I worked for him for 5 years in Rapid City. Then he was moved to Denver, and I went to Denver, worked 2 more years for him in Denver, and he helped me with a little bit of money, along with Father Aquila, then now Arch.
Wow. It is like the OG squad. It is like you guys, all the originals. I love this.
Yeah,
Goodness.
no, it was great. Those were heady days because Tim
Hmm.
Gray and I and Curtis Martin, and then later on Ted Sri were all together at Steubenville. That was quite a
Yeah.
class.
Yeah. That's such a beautiful reclamation there. And so therefore that's the birth of the Augustine Institute.
Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah. That's all the people who were involved were right there, from the beginning. So it was a really terrific thing. So which just goes to show you, it's not what you know, it's who you know.
There you go. This is the same for the industries in theology as well as in media production. It is
Sure.
completely true. You know what's funny? I love the strain through of kind of a very classical understanding of the Franciscans to the Dominicans and therefore Thomism. I can, especially since I've been editing Symbolon so much, my joke now is I can spot I can spot Dominican. I can spot somebody who has a heady St. Thomas Aquinas quote around the corner, judging by how they speak, by their approach. In like 2 minutes, I can sort out the spirituality of someone. So obviously, I'm very fond of one thing that's been very exciting to see is not just in the graduate school that we have at the AI, but in the wider circles that we inhabit. Is I grew up in public school, for instance.
Mhm.
So Catholic school growing up, and I was born in the mid 90s. So in the early 2000s, mid 2000s, I understood that Catholic school was really just like a private school with Jesus sometimes. I mean, I had friends that went to Catholic school and I wasn't. I'm very fortunate to have survived public school with a pretty strong faith, but there wasn't really anything in the area that for my parents would have grabbed them, particularly for the core of a Catholic education. There was no such thing as I didn't even when anyone had ever told me classical education back in high school, I would have thought you were talking about the ancient Greeks and how they had tutors or something. But you do see this interest, this resurgence, and we have some very big schools around the archdiocese that are moving with this model. What does classical education mean? And is that a sort of reclamation of what Catholic education should look like?
Yeah, well, that's a very interesting question. We're Augustinians, we're at the Augustine Institute. And so Augustine had sort of mixed feelings about his classical preparation, right?
Yeah.
So if you read his confessions, he considered it a corrupting influence. And so it's important to sort out what is worth retaining from the
Mm.
old idea, the old uh, humanitas, right?
Hmm.
The form of formation or malformation that happened in the Greco-Roman world, and Catholic education. And Augustine is really the figure who recast classical education in a Christian form. Others had, many of the fathers had received that kind of formation. But Augustine is really the person, because of his own predilections and practices and previous experience. There's a lot of
Hmm.
alliteration in this, not true.
Yeah.
Uh, uh, was was sort of providentially formed to do this work, and he's really responsible for the intellectual dimension in priestly formation. I would say the philosophical uh,
Mm.
portion of priestly formation in the West, especially. The tendency for monks to be engaged in intellectual work. That all of that largely comes from Augustine and the kinds of monastic houses he set up, and of course his rule stands behind the Dominicans. They follow the Augustinian rule. The Norbertines do as well. They're
Hmm.
Augustinians. So um, so our Augustinian patrimony is really what orders us towards valuing classical education, but in its Christian expression. And Augustine's idea was that the there are really two dimensions, right? That he recognized that there were corrupting influences in the literary dimension of the Greco-Roman paideia,
Mm.
and so he replaced those ancient sort of sacred histories, with our sacred history, which is the Bible. So he puts the
Hmm.
Bible, the foundation and capstone of the educational pyramid, the old liberal arts pyramid, right, of
Hmm.
trivium and quadrivium, and then philosophy. He highlights the importance of philosophy, and then he puts, the study of scripture, sacra pagina, at the very height of the educational enterprise. And and so what he works is a renovation of that ancient classical pattern. Now, today we're reading Homer again. Augustine would have said, no, don't do that, but
Mm.
we do, because we want to have this a sufficient literary background to understand the highlights of Western civilization generally, and we're able to approach it from a Catholic perspective, with the
Yeah.
advantages of sacramental grace, right, which enable us to handle that better than Augustine would have been able to handle it when he was a kid.
What
Um,
is this the necessity for, obviously there's a lot of talk with Thomism and stuff, but one joke with St. Thomas is that it seems like in this era, we almost baptize Aristotle. So is it easier kind of post that development that makes it easier for us to go back to Homer or something like that?
well, yeah, I mean, Aristotle's a tremendous advantage, and Augustine had read Aristotle also. It wasn't just St.
Hmm.
Thomas.
Yeah.
You can see in his work he read the categories. He speaks fluent Aristotelian, in his works like De Ordine and other works about education, right? The pattern
Mm.
of education. So no, but you're right. I mean, this is Chesterton's point in his description of St. Thomas, right? He had a kind of immediate insight into what was the critical dimension of St. Thomas. And it's also, interestingly enough, in his book on St. Francis, just to get back to
I go back to it always.
yeah, because he saw that Francis was able to sort of embrace nature again
Mm-hmm.
because of this long fast, right? This long penitential fast of Catholicism. Finally in the 13th century, we were free of the problems of ancient Greco-Roman paganism and everything it yielded, right? Especially, certain grotesque sexual actions, right? So
Mm-hmm.
he said that after that long fast, the church was able to sort of re-embrace nature
Mm-hmm.
again. And so you get a sort of purification of the spirit in Francis, and you get a purification of intellect in Saint Dominic and then Saint Thomas.
Yeah.
And I've always been convicted that what we need to return to really is a Franciscan spirituality and a Thomistic theology,
Mm.
because in the 13th century you really get the highest and most purified expression of the perfection of charity, right, and poverty in Francis,
Yeah.
and this kind of and a superlative expression of graced intellect in St. Thomas. And you don't necessarily want, from my perspective anyway, sorry to the Franciscans, but you don't want, from my perspective, you don't want to go to Francis for theology,
Mm-hmm.
right? Um, but you do want a radical embrace
Yeah.
of poverty, right?
Mm.
And the church needs that purification again, and as well as a fulsome revival of Thomism.
Mm. I think that's very beautifully said and considered. I love the different and I love how the different sort of and this is the beauty of the Catholic faith. A lot of these different traditions, a lot of things to draw from. They're they're harmonious together. They're not in these like knuckle down oppositions, and you can kind of see the strengths of one and the weaknesses of another, and how they need each other. But I very much like that perspective, the idea of a Franciscan charity, definitely, and a sort of Thomistic theology. I definitely can understand that. So with the idea of a resurgent classical education, right? It's to almost again rebaptize it in a Christian context. But do you find, I mean, obviously, like we work on curriculums and everything together.
Mm-hmm.
Is this kind of the antidote to some of the ills that we are finding? How Catholic education has drifted some places, right? I mean, I love our graduate school. I think it's very protected. A lot of places out there, it's become just a Catholic identity. It's just a private school that has occasionally a sister will teach you or something like this. Is this going to be kind of a return back to how we should be oriented as persons in Christ to the understanding of the intellect?
Yeah, I think my wife is always saying that you can't really have classical education without Catholicism.
Mm,
And I think she's right that that we see classical schools forming. My youngest daughter went to a Hillsdale school, classical school, right,
hmm.
nearby, but it's not quite the same thing. She got a lot of good stuff because many of her teachers are Catholics, right, and
Yeah.
they're teaching in the classical school. But without that Catholic dimension, it's going to lack something. And I would also add that it's critical to go back and rediscover Augustine's take on these elements. And I would say, as regards particularly one element, and uh, in his De Ordine, which is a work on providence and the persistence of evil, really, and how to work against that. So it goes directly to the question you've asked, right? How do we heal the ills that we're suffering from? He says that what's needed is the rediscovery of providence, right? That there's order in the world, and we live in a very disordered world, and the world
Mm,
assails us constantly with attacks against our conviction that God is behind everything, and that he has a plan which is loving and purposeful and provides meaning to things. And Augustine faces this question very early in his career, And just as he's coming into the church, so he's in the catechumenate when he works up this text, right? And he basically describes how you structure a liberal education so that the order that God has inscribed in the world will be assimilated into your mind,
Mm-hmm.
and as the means by which you recover your confidence in the provident God. And then the addition of the Bible, right, in the curriculum, which he gets to later, in De Doctrina Christiana, where he talks about, the interpretation and the teaching of the Bible. He indicates that that's the way to recover our confidence in God's providence in history. So it's sort of two dimensions of providence. One is God's providence in as creator, right? So the way in which he has arranged the universe to disclose himself to us, right, as the first book, as St. Bonaventure says, a good Franciscan theologian, right?
Hey.
Uh, um, the first book of Revelation, and then the second book, which is the Scripture, restructures history, so cosmos in movement. And between those two things, I would say that's the perfect medicine against the disorder, the chaos that we see around us today, and which tends to penetrate us and fill our souls. So an Augustinian appraisal of classical education, I think, is exactly what we need. And that's what we're doing at the AI and the new MA in Catholic education that we're launching.
Mm-hmm. Well, I love, and you read about that Augustinian thing, because one thing I love in every program that we do, because I of course see how we express our education through that, but everything we do, it's like we go back to Genesis. It's like the
Yep.
very first thing, always back to the garden, always back to the garden, just immediately priming where man is, where he sits with God, and then from there can flow all the other bits of whether we're going through the sacraments or whether we're going through um, what our role is, like man as the image and likeness of God. It's kind of a beautiful thing, the reoccurring event, and that's something that even for my own formation as a Catholic, it's something that approach is very new to me. That
Mhm.
approach is I didn't have that in CCD class. I never went to Catholic school or anything like that, and that's something that I realize in my soul has been such a fulfilling thing to see. That must be good for the students too.
Yeah. Well, this is a central facet of Augustinianism, is the narration of salvation history, Narratio. And his work, De Catechizandis Rudibus, is specifically about this, how to do it. And he describes it, its methodology. He talks about how to maintain your enthusiasm as a catechist, and then he gives a sample of the narration of salvation history. So it's a biblical first catechesis, so charismatic, first announcement of the gospel, but in historical form. And that's what we've been doing from the beginning at the Augustine Institute. And he says specifically, because your experience exactly reflects the Augustinian influence. Where do you begin your catechesis? And he answers the question from the words, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth," and then up to the present time of the church. He says so. And what this does is it gives us, as he says, our basic identity as Christians, and um, we would say worldview, Christian worldview, right?
Mm-hmm.
From the vantage point of the universal history which is disclosed in the Bible, and then continued on in the life of the church. So he says, everything that God has revealed is to disclose Christ and his church. And so the church is a kind of continuation of salvation history. And he uses that, this is part of the preambles of faith, right, as a demonstration of the truths of Christian claims, that what, prophecy and fulfillment, typological fulfillment from Old Testament to New, right? And then everything that Christ prophesied about the church has come true.
Mm-hmm.
All that remains is the eschaton, right? So we can trust, because the old prophecies have been fulfilled, that Christ's prophecies of the end will be fulfilled as well. And that what he said about the church is true. Therefore, you can have confidence, right? This is the line I've used over and over again with my students. Without faith, history is just one damn thing after another.
Oh, I
Right?
like that.
But with faith, it's an economy of salvation, right?
Mm,
And that's providence, right? That's
yeah.
the work of providence. And that's what we need to regain for ourselves and give to others. Confidence in the provident God who loves us and has ordered both creation and history in accord with his plan of love to give himself to us, right?
Mm.
And that's our aim. That's our whole aim at the Augustine Institute.
That is so beautifully well said. I don't want to take forever because we definitely could, but I'll just wind down with this last question, Sean, and thank you so much for coming on.
Very,
Obviously,
very
we could you'll have to come on again. We could just obviously fill a whole month with just talking shop. I find this right. I find that generally when I look at the world, I think that the sort of um, secular rationalism that I certainly, as a Catholic, was challenged with more so growing up. I find it giving way to something else different. I find it kind of giving way to almost like an old fashioned paganism. I find that I'm encountering more people who believe that either themselves are at the center of the universe or their own will is at the center. And it's not in this atheistic sense of, well, I control my destiny in a scientific sense. It's very much like I manifest my destiny out there, right?
yeah,
I
yeah.
think that this is, on one hand, I'm kind of excited because I feel like this is a frontier that Catholics can understand. We've done this before in our history, and on the other, it's always nice to see maybe the French Revolution's changing a little bit. I can accept that, but on the other side, it obviously is quite scary because it does leave a big question of where the importance of how we educate ourselves as Catholics, and of course where the church's role will be. So when you think about you are quite literally training the generations to come of catechesis of catechists, and you've taught not just laity but there's also clergy in the classes, right? What is the one thing to kind of that you think going forward in the future that we'll need to be armed with to sort of face these sort of difficulties?
Boy, that's very insightful, Jordan. The You're right. Things are kind of shifting away from the necessity of a rational apologetic to something else, and you can see this. You see this in Jordan Peterson.
Hmm.
Um, I don't know if you know Jonathan Pajot.
Yep.
Some of these, the symbolic world, and those, uh, they're they're we're kind of seeing across the culture a sort of rejection of the old ideologies of the 19th century, a kind of restive desire to return to more elemental things.
Hmm.
Um, and in a certain sense, I'm not trying to blow my horn here, but I feel more fitted for that really, um, than the rational apologetic, because I was a romantic. I am a romantic,
Yeah.
and sort of that's what drew me to the church. I understand this generation better, right? I understand their dissatisfactions because they're the same ones I had,
Mm.
right? I wanted to get back to the cosmos, right? I wanted to get back to sort of those immediate foundational experiences, and I ended up finding them in Saint Francis, right? The guy who walked naked out into the world, who wandered around in the rain, and that um, I think this generation actually will respond better to that, the otherness that I was talking about. They're kind of looking for that, right? Where
Yeah.
where can I find that holy other, this radical re-embrace of the world that comes from, the mysterious hand of God, and not just have all the answers to all the technical questions, right? People are just sick and tired of technocracy
Mm.
and the totalitarian imposition of rules and regulations,
Mm.
many of which are just not, tied to any
Yeah, any
any
logic with it.
rationality at all,
Hmm.
right? So they're just sick of that, and I think they're looking for something else. And has the church has everything, right? Not just a beautiful Thomistic system, which clearly describes everything, right? But also this elemental dimension of a tremendous closeness to the cosmos, and coming once again, that sort of Franciscan embrace of the world again and creation again, free of, the problems of pollution and human interference and those kinds of things. So there are lots of, agrarians and,
Yeah, Catholic homesteading's taken off, which
Yeah.
I'm a farm boy, so I get that.
Yeah. So, and making your own beer and smoking pipes and all that kind of stuff that is, that points back to something more elemental and sort of pre-modern.
Yeah, completely right. Dr. Innerst, it has been an absurd pleasure. Are there any books, any plugs that you want to turn our audience onto?
Well, all the books I would plug right now are out of print.
Where this is a traditional Catholic channel, that's kind of like our thing. We define the things that are out of print. So, have you written anything?
What's that?
Have you written anything?
I have about 3 or 4 books in my computer.
Okay.
I've got 4 books on the 4 parts of the Catechism that I can't get anybody to publish. And then I've got several things underway. One that's 3/4 finished on matrimony, and I'm working with a book on catechesis with Jared Stout.
Oh wow!
Also.
Oh wow!
So,
that'll be killer. Okay, so when they come out, let me know. Always, and vice versa. Well, thank you so much for coming on. It's been a pleasure. Catholics, ladies and gentlemen all over, if you liked what we had to say, please go ahead. We'd love to hear your own stories, your own conversion stories, your own approaches in Catholic education or experiences. Don't forget to like, comment, and share this video. Thank you all of our YouTube members and our patrons who help make the show possible. Go on over to patreon.com/GladTriedPodcast or join the YouTube membership if you would like to support the show further. We are grateful. Pray for us and we will pray for you. Until next time, God bless you. May He keep you. Adios.